Marwechanga, Ghana Miana Wangari, Mani de Bunni Ghana Yadana. Naibiriko, Mankalagala, Tandanya, Mianaku. Naito Yungandalia, Naito Yakalandalia, Padni Adlu Wadu. On behalf of the Ghana people, I welcome you all to Ghana country, and I do this ambassador of the Adelaide Plains people. My brothers, my sisters, let's walk together in harmony.
Good evening. Full room. I begin tonight, as is our custom, by acknowledging the traditional owners of the country. Thank you, Uncle Lewis. I pay my respects to the Ghana people of the Adelaide Plains and to your elders and ancestors. I also pay my respects to all other elders and advocates present here tonight. It is a privilege indeed to be associated with an event that honours two remarkable Aboriginal women leaders and the memory of a great Australian and South Australian in Dunstan. I'm Tanya Hosh and I'm Joint Campaign Director for Recognise. I'm pleased to have been invited to say a few words by way of introduction tonight, just as I have in previous years, of the Lowitja O'Donoghue Oration run by the Dunstan Foundation. And on a personal note, can I say this is particularly an honour because both Dr O'Donoghue and Professor Langton have invested in my learning and development over many, many years. In each of them, I have found inspiration, courage, and be challenged to do what I can to add in some small way to their massive body of work and achievement. The great Dr Lowitja O'Donoghue is a veteran in the hard and serious work for forging change. She deserves our profound respect. Over the years, this oration in her name has featured many other great leaders for change. Professor Patrick Dodson, Olga Havnen, Michael Kirby, Paul Keating, Ray Martin, Jackie Huggins, Fred Chaney and the Reverend Tim Costello. I left out their honorific titles, but only because they are so extensive that if I provided them, it would take up all of the time that I have here. But what a list. And tonight another name joins this esteemed list, Professor Marcia Langton. She's already well known to you, of course, but I have got time to read out her honorifics, but only just. A BA in Honours from the ANU, a PhD from Macquarie University, AM from the Australian Honours List, a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences of Australia, a member of the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, a member of boards too numerous to mention, a former Boyer lecturer, and currently holder of the Foundation Chair of the Australian Indigenous Studies at the University of Melbourne. Tonight, Professor Langton takes us on the unfinished business from the 1967 referendum. Ridding our constitution of race-based clauses, recognising tens of thousands of years of occupation and ownership, raising living standards through economic development, and closing the gap by creating jobs and supporting more young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to further their education. These are some of her causes. I know tonight she will outline them with the sort of passionate eloquence that we have come to expect from her. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome the 2015 Lowitja O'Donoghue Orator, Professor Marcia Langton.
I acknowledge the Gurrana traditional owners. Thank you, Uncle Lewis. I acknowledge your elders, past and present. Thank you for having me on your country. I also acknowledge the amazing woman after whom this oration has been named, Lowitja O'Donoghue, Dr Lowitja O'Donoghue, and her profoundly important contribution to the nation, to Indigenous affairs, to Indigenous health reform, and I especially want to record my personal appreciation for her leadership of our country. I also acknowledge the great Don Dunstan, former Premier of this state. He was one of the supporters of the 1967 referendum question to remove racially discriminatory clauses from the Constitution. He was a great reformer and supported many bills and initiatives that have improved our lives. It is a great honour to present this oration to Lowitja and in memory of Don Dunstan. It was the great Arnhem Land leader Galarrwuy Yunupingu, the elder of the Gumatj clan in northeast Arnhem Land, who in 2007 raised with me his desire to see Aboriginal people recognised in the Constitution. He was particularly concerned to ensure that his Yolngu people have a rightful place in the nation. Noel Pearson came to visit, and together we talked about how this might be achieved. As far as I know, Noel had never met Galarrwuy face to face, but had followed his activities because for much of his adult life, Galarrwuy had served as chairman of the Northern Land Council, which was in its day a very powerful organisation. Galarrwuy was the interpreter for Justice Woodward, the Land Rights Commissioner appointed by Whitlam, and learnt from a young age about clan matters, cultural history, heritage and landscapes. He was trained by his father to be the leader of the clan. His father was Mungarawuy, and Mungarawuy and others took the first native title case in Australia, Millipum v Nabalco. The Australian case that laid out the flawed legal fiction of terra nullius. Native title was later recognised in 1992 by the High Court in Mabo No. 2, which of course, as we know, dismissed the legal fiction of terra nullius. Noel is much younger than Galarrwuy and believed incorrectly that Galarrwuy was on the left and himself a man of the right. Neither is true. And as each of them is a problem solver with little regard for shibboleths of the parties if they do not advance Aboriginal interests, it took some time for each of them to realise this. In this regard, they are very similar in their thinking, but it took some time, as I say. Several Aboriginal leaders are like that, eclectic in their policy stances and always problem-solving with the best thinking, whether notionally of the left or of the right. And this is how I remember Lowitja, a problem solver, could I say, with the greatest respect, the Olivia Pope of Aboriginal affairs. This is because of the terrible impact that libertarian views and the belief in racial exceptionalism, especially in relation to economic participation, alcohol, drugs and violence, have had on our population. Standing on the sacred land in Gulkula in Galarrwuy's estate, Noel picked up a very large branch and asked Galarrwuy to hold the other side of it and push it with him. And they pushed it backwards and forwards, and Noel said, "This is what we have to do. You have to push from the left and I have to push from the right, and then we'll win and arrive at a solution that combines our ideas." This idea of the dialectical relationship and its effect in allowing creative synthesis of apparently conflicting ideas has long been a source of intellectual inspiration in Noel's work. Noel thus began his friendship with Galarrwuy. Following this, at my instigation, Galarrwuy gave 2 lectures at the University of Melbourne on this very topic of constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians and how the future of Australia might accommodate us with honour. I've entitled my lecture tonight, Our Constitutional Reform Dilemma, to Win or to Delay, but I will return in extemporis to the topic I raised in the original title. Galarrwuy envisages a future Australia in which our legal, constitutional, economic and cultural aspirations could survive and flourish. The fates favoured his ideas during these final months of the Howard government. His visit to our university's House Staff Club coincided with Kevin Rudd's visit, and a brief discussion in the entry hallway sparked some interest from Rudd in the challenge of accommodating Aboriginal concerns. Jenny Macklin, who later became the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs under the Rudd and Gillard governments, attended one of his lectures, and she was very interested in what Galarrwuy had to say. Some years later, Prime Minister Gillard appointed an expert panel to investigate the recognition of Indigenous Australians in the Australian Constitution. Here tonight I will summarise the expert panel's recommendations, Noel Pearson's proposition, and Frank Brennan's proposition. But first, let me make it clear that I believe that any idea of race and the ability of the Parliament to use race in its lawmaking should be removed from our Constitution. Because of the way that the notion of race has been historically applied to Indigenous people in Australia, our rights to peoplehood have been undermined. I believe that our peoplehood should be recognised. I'm arguing that defining Aboriginal people as a race, as the Constitution does, sets up the conditions for Indigenous people to be treated not just as different but exceptional and inherently incapable of joining the Australian polity and society. The history of legislation and policy applied to Indigenous Australians demonstrates this in a number of ways. Not fully citizens until after the 1967 referendum, the shameful effects of the nearly half-century-old Community Development Employment Program, a work for the Dole scheme, which was returned in another guise, the Northern Territory Emergency Intervention, and this is only to name a few of the exceptionalist initiatives that have isolated the Aboriginal world from Australian economic and social life. In turn, many Indigenous Australians have developed a sense of entitlement and adopt the mantle of the exceptional Indigene, the subject of special treatment on the grounds of race. My experiences across Australia during the past 50 years have impressed upon me how this exceptional status, to which many Aboriginal people have ascribed unwittingly, involves a degree of self-loathing, dehumanisation, and complicity in racism. As the exotic, Aboriginal people are not required to be normal, such as attending school regularly or competing in a meritocracy, except, of course, might I add, in the AFL and NRL and some other sports codes. In the slowly building campaign for constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians, it is vital that we broaden the understanding that the constitutional tradition of treating Aborigines as a race must be replaced with the idea of First Peoples. The problem is not race, but racial discrimination. Indigenous people define themselves according to their lineages and cultures that tie them to places and ways of life that existed long before colonisation. So, for instance, in my case, I'm a descendant of the Yiman people. My grandfather was Fred Waddy, his twin brother was Ted Waddy, and their ancestors are buried in a mass grave at the no longer existing Bundalla Reserve near Taroom in the Upper Dawson Valley of Queensland. There's a very long family history, but I can proudly call myself a Yiman woman. If we accept the principles of defining the status of Australia's Indigenous people according to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, then the power that the 19th century race theories have had on our society through our Constitution and scores of legislative acts become null and void. Not immediately, of course, but over time. This would not be a simple task, I need to say. I served on the expert panel appointed by Prime Minister Julia Gillard, as did Noel Pearson and many others. Since the expert panel recommendations were presented to Prime Minister Gillard and published, Prime Minister Abbott has made an unequivocal commitment to supporting recognition of Indigenous Australians in the Constitution. So too did Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. In recent times, in the last month, several arguments have been mounted against those recommendations, and a no case has been threatened. The question is, what will constitute recognition, and what would recognition mean? However, before we become too optimistic, let me also warn that if a no case is formalised, as Cory Bernardi threatens, and funded by the government, and included in the question papers to be put to a referendum, constitutional recognition of Indigenous people will almost certainly fail. In the history of Australian referendums, all those questions which have had a formal no case have been voted against by the majority of Australians. Ours is the most difficult constitution in the world to change. Not only do a majority of voters have to vote positively for a question put in a referendum to Australian voters, each Australian state parliament must vote in the affirmative and in the majority for a constitutional change. There is no other constitution in the world that is so difficult to change as the Australian Constitution. And as a result, only 8 out of 44 questions in Australia's history have succeeded. Some of us who served on the expert panel on constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians are concerned to ensure that when the proposed referendum question is settled, we have a strategy to avoid failure at the referendum. If this question fails at a referendum proposed to be held by Prime Minister Tony Abbott in 2017 on the anniversary of the 1967 referendum, it will not be supported by any government in the future. A negative vote would completely rule out any question of this being taken up again in our lifetimes. Those of us who have considered this matter would rather leave it to another generation rather than have a failure now. And hence the title that I've devised for tonight, To Win or to Delay. The exclusion of Aboriginal people from the nation's constitution took place in the 19th century. In the 19th century, the Federation movement began with a speech by Henry Parkes, the Premier of the colony of New South Wales. In 1889 at Tenterfield, he called for the colonies to unite and create a great national government for all Australia. At that time, Australia was 6 colonies. All Australian colonies reported back to the Home Office in London and on matters of state, and were, in most important ways, governed from the Home Office. Parkes wrote to the other colonial premiers proposing a meeting to discuss a constitution for the new nation, at which he famously remarked that the crimson thread of kinship runs through us all. By this he referred to the common British heritage of the colonists as the basis upon which the new nation might be founded. Parkes initiated a decade of conventions and public debate, which culminated in the Constitution and the Australian Federation in 1901. So the Constitution was drafted at 2 constitutional conventions. These were tremendously important, and most people who are interpreting the Constitution read those conventions and read the debates to look for the spirit of what was meant in the actual constitutional drafting. So the convention transcripts and speeches are quite powerful in their impact on Australian society today. And so I'll extemporise briefly to say that we too need our conventions today on this matter, as soon as possible. And of course, some of us would like to see 4, one in the north, one in the east, one in the south, and one in the west, to accommodate Aboriginal debate on this proposition of the recognition of Indigenous people in the Constitution. In the late 19th century, the main issues at the conventions were the financial and trade issues. So at that time, the colonies could not trade with each other. They had to write back to the Home Office to get permission to trade with each other. There was no free trade across the colonial borders, and unable to do anything jointly about finance, each colony operated independently as a financial unit, which was very restricting in terms of building the economy. What they were considering was how best to weigh the interests of the small states against those of the more populous states, counting only the white population. in the new federal parliament that they proposed. So, how would New South Wales and Victoria stand against the smaller states? All the white people were in New South Wales and Victoria, and there were a few scattered elsewhere in the country. So, with New South Welshmen and Victorians paying taxes, did they have to hand their taxes over to the other states with large Aboriginal populations? The same old budgetary problems that we see today. This is why Aboriginal people were excluded from the Constitution, to prevent the colonies with large Aboriginal populations from getting a greater share of the tax distributions that would have been funded by New South Wales and Victorian white populations alone. Customs, duties, tariffs, and the capacity of the upper house to veto money bills were of far greater concern to the convention delegates than anything else. No Indigenous person attended any of the conventions, nor did any delegates seek to represent their interests. At one point, one of the delegates proposed that New Zealand be part of Australia, and then there were complaints about including the Maoris and the possibility, therefore, of including Aborigines in the recognised population. Hence, New Zealand, the Maoris and Aborigines were excluded, the Aborigines quite formally so. There was a long interregnum, but they eventually made a fresh start with the 1897-98 convention, at which they revised the draft. It was endorsed by the 1891 convention and put to the people of the colonies of New South Wales, South Australia, Tasmania and Victoria. No referendum was held in Queensland or Western Australia. The draft constitution received the majority support in each of the 4 colonies holding referendums, but was nevertheless deemed unsuccessful in New South Wales because the number of people that voted for the draft did not reach the minimum of 80,000 required by the New South Wales Parliament. It was then amended again in 1899 at a conference attended by the premiers, and in 1899 and 1900 it was again put to the voters in the colonies, this time also in Western Australia and Queensland, and thus later, and then at those elections supported by the majority of voters in each colony. But large sections of the community were excluded from voting, including most women and many Aboriginal people. Women were able to vote for or against the draft constitution only in South Australia and Western Australia, while Aboriginal people were able to vote only in New South Wales, South Australia, Tasmania and Victoria. However, even where Aboriginal people had a legal entitlement to vote, there is no evidence that they did so. So it is, I think, reasonable to conclude that Aboriginal people played no role in the Constitution. In 1899 and 1900, a delegation of the Australian colonies went to London to have the draft constitution enacted by the British Parliament. The Imperial Parliament still exercised ultimate authority over the Australian colonies, and the Act was introduced to the House of Commons and completed its passage through the Imperial Parliament on 5th of July 1900, was assented to by Queen Victoria on 9th of July 1900 and came into force on 1st of January 1901. It was entitled the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act 1900. Section 9 of the Act reads, "The Constitution of the Commonwealth shall be as follows," and thereafter the Act contains the entire text of our Constitution. Most of our young Australians have no idea that our Constitution sits in a glass cabinet in Westminster. 2 of our constitutional experts, Megan Davis and George Williams of the University of New South Wales, have published a book, Everything You Need to Know About the Referendum to Recognise Indigenous Australians. Helpfully, at the very beginning of the book, they have set out summaries of the case for yes and the case for no. So let me tell you about their summaries, or recite their summaries. The case for yes, they write, is the following. The Constitution was drafted to exclude Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples from the political settlement that brought about the Australian nation. It is important that the Constitution, the founding document of the nation, recognises Australia's full history, not just the period from British settlement. We need to remove discrimination from our Constitution. It should prevent rather than permit racial discrimination so that all Australians are treated equally. Recognition in the Constitution would protect against the future loss of Australia's unique Indigenous cultures, which are a vital part of our national identity. Recognition will help improve Indigenous health and well-being. A successful referendum to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in the Constitution would be an uplifting achievement that unites Australians. The no case is as follows. There are more important issues to address. Rather than changing the Constitution, Australia's politicians should focus on ending Indigenous disadvantage by way of health and education reforms. Changing the Constitution is expensive. There are better things to spend tens of millions of dollars on. The Constitution has worked well enough for more than a century. It should not be changed or tinkered with unless there is a compelling reason. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. The High Court would be left to make sense of what the changes mean, and judges could bring about unintended consequences. There is no agreement about how the Constitution should be changed. Even Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have different views. Unless there is unanimity, no referendum should be held. So these are the broad grounds of the debate as it is being conducted today, but there are more details to understand. As I said, the most crucial matter to understand about our Constitution is that when it was drafted in the 19th century, it specifically excluded Aboriginal people on the grounds of race, and it is this exclusion that lies at the heart of the state-authorised discrimination that continues to this day. Ironically, as George Williams points out, the change actually laid the seeds for the Commonwealth to pass laws that impose a disadvantage on Indigenous peoples. And of course, that was the Hindmarsh Island case that went to the High Court, in which the judges were split on whether Section 51(26) should be interpreted as allowing or disallowing racial discrimination, and in the end, the most widely understood summary of that case is that even though the court was split, we should accept that the Constitution allows for racial discrimination against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. There is another matter that is worth mentioning about our Constitution, and it is that its preamble is a 19th century concoction of imperial forelock tugging in the Act of the British Parliament, which, as I say, sits in a glass case in Westminster in London, and it is not therefore possible to change the preamble because it is not an act of our own Parliament. In a more innocent time, Australians understood the proposition about the rights of Aboriginal people, although perhaps in a less sophisticated way. Australians voted overwhelmingly in favour of removing discrimination, or at least some of it, in the referendum on the 27th of May 1967. And can I say about this photo, the lady with her back to us with the white flowery hat is the sister of my grandfather's twin brother's first wife, Auntie Celia. And she was a wonderful campaigner.